everyone, and welcome to the Troy Public Library. I'm Anna Barlow, an Adult Services Librarian, and we're so glad that you could join us tonight. We'd like to thank the Friends of the Troy Public Library for sponsoring tonight's program, as well as many others that we present. This evening, we welcome best-selling journalist Nathan Bomey, who will be discussing his latest work with the Troy Public Library Director, Emily Dumas. The title of his new book is Bridge Builders, Bringing People Together in a Polarized Age. To put this work together, Bomey sought out individuals who refused to accept the current crisis of polarization, choosing instead to build bridges which foster dialogue, mend broken relationships, and find common ground. His book profiles countercultural leaders who believe in the power of forging lasting connections to bring about profound change. Let's go now to Nathan Bomey and Emily Dumas to find out more about this important work and what was learned along the way.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, Nathan. I would like to welcome everybody and thank you for attending tonight. I'm going to introduce our guest. Nathan Bomey is an author, journalist, and scriptwriter. He joined USA Today as a business reporter in 2015. His beat includes a wide range of news, including how business is changing, the auto industry, bankruptcy, and the business of personal health. Before joining USA Today, he was a reporter for several years at the Detroit Free Press, where he covered General Motors and the Detroit bankruptcy. The newest of his 3 nationally published nonfiction books is Bridge Builders, Bringing People Together in a Polarized Age, a forensic portrait of Americans who are helping people find common ground despite their differences. His second book was After the Fact, The Erosion of Truth and the Inevitable Rise of Donald Trump, which chronicled the age of misinformation. And his first book, Detroit Resurrected, To Bankruptcy and Back, told the inside story of the Detroit bankruptcy. In his role at USA Today, Nathan also makes regular appearances on national TV and radio networks, including CNN, MSNBC, and NPR. He is also currently serving as the principal scriptwriter on a full-length documentary film about the Detroit bankruptcy. A graduate of Saline High School and Eastern Michigan University, Nathan grew up in the Ann Arbor area, and his parents still live in Saline, where he got his start in community journalism at his local weekly newspaper. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, to get started, the book is still fairly new. Congratulations, by the way, on the book.
Thank you.
For those in our audience who have not had a chance to read it yet, can you just tell us a little bit about what it's about and what inspired you to cover this topic?
Sure. So back in 2018, I published a book on the age of misinformation, like you mentioned, and why people are so polarized over so many different issues. And then as a national journalist, I live it every day where I see how people, there's so much hate, there's so much division, sometimes directed at journalists, sometimes you see it in the comments section, sometimes you see it in people you interview. And I said to myself, I've got to go out and meet people who aren't accepting the status quo. I have to go out and meet people who are trying to bridge differences, whether it's race, politics, religion, class, or culture, just anything that's dividing people. I want to meet people who just aren't accepting that status quo and are trying to bring people together. And so that's what I did, and it's funny because I actually realized a little bit after I started the project that, I actually started it in the midst of the longest government shutdown in US history, which feels like a long time ago now and feels actually like something kind of quaint that almost get compared to what happened next, all the polarizing things that have happened since then. But it's funny because my wife and I actually took a metro trip in Washington down to the White House area in late 2018, shortly after I kind of started to start to work on the book. And we walked down to see the national Christmas tree, wanted to see the lights, and walked down to the tree and for some reason the lights were off. We walk up and find what's going on. They can't put the lights on because of how divided the government is. The Christmas tree is off. Christmas is canceled. Like, this is not Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer here. This is real life. And that just being sort of a kind of absurd little example, and obviously a little comical, of how divided we are. And so, so I basically went out and I went to places like Appalachia. I went to Detroit. I went to Minneapolis, to DC, to Annapolis, Maryland, and I talked to other people by the phone, San Diego, Iraq, Australia, across the world, really. All my in-person trips before COVID, to be honest, shows you how long this has been going on. And and trying to tell their stories, and what can we learn from them? What kind of lessons are there that we can apply? And so that's what I did. I put together this book. Like, I'm the sort of not very smart journalist who goes to Washington and writes a book about trying to bring people together instead of tearing them apart, which is what most of the books are about. But I just feel like, as a journalist, there is an opportunity for me to use my platform to try to do what I think we can all agree, regardless of your beliefs, as a nation, we need to do to make progress together.
I completely agree. And I was excited when I read the description of your book, because I was thinking, gosh, there's not a lot of resources out there for people actually trying to bring people together. So this is a very important work.
Thank you.
At the beginning, too, the introduction, you presented some pretty surprising statistics. I found that really interesting about different political parties and their perceptions of the other side. So can you kind of recap some of those for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to understand the problem before you can address the solution. Isabel Wilkerson, in her book Caste, where she writes about the nation's racial division, says, the doctor doesn't come into the office and say, I don't care about your medical history. I mean, the first question a doctor is going to ask is, what is your history? What is the state of things? I need to understand what has happened here. And so I didn't want to focus much of the book on the problem. I wanted to focus most of it on the solutions, but I also knew that you got to frame it around what are the problems. And so I spent a few pages in each part kind of outlining those. And yeah, some of the stats, I mean, like, it's nearly 90% of Americans have some sort of feeling of hate, or some sort of feeling that the other side is hateful, or the other side is bigoted, or the other side is spiteful. And it's almost across the board. Like, it's pretty remarkable. What political scientists call this is actually not just polarization, but affective, or with an A, polarization, which means I don't just dislike you or disagree with you because of the issues and what you believe. I disagree with you because of who you are. Like, that's how deep it goes. Because when you actually look at the data suggests that we actually agree on more than you might think. But we don't realize that in a lot of cases. There's this term called second order beliefs, which is this premise of sort of what you believe that other people believe. And Americans are way off on that. Like, we actually tend to think that the other side, or whatever the issue is more extreme than they actually are when you ask that side, what do they think? And so that sort of illustrates both the opportunity and the challenge, in the sense that we may not actually be as divided as we feel, but perception is reality.
Yeah. So each chapter covered a different bridge builder, somebody who's working towards bridging these communication gaps. Can you tell us some examples of these bridge builders? And then if there's any qualities that you noticed that they all shared in common?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many great stories, and it's kind of like your kids or something, hard to pick the best one, but one that I would mention is a man named Bob Inglis, who is a former Republican congressman from South Carolina, who was really from one of the most conservative districts in the country, conservative Christian, really true-blooded Republican, who was fiercely opposed to Bill Clinton and Al Gore in the 1990s. But around the early 2000s, he started to change his perspective on the environment. And it was because of relationships that he developed, but relationship he had with his son, who convinced him that he had to start to pay attention to climate change, but also a relationship that he developed with an Australian climate scientist who he met on a trip to Australia to see the effects of climate change on the Great Barrier Reef, which is, of course, slowly dying off because of climate change. And he realized in that relationship with the Australian climate scientist, who was a Christian himself, that to do something about climate change doesn't require you to be like some sort of earth worshiper, that like you're not worshiping the earth, you're actually stewarding God's gift. And so he realized that with that different perspective, he could take that back to Washington and try to actually engage other conservatives on taking action on climate. And what I found so interesting about his story is that he says that the problem with a lot of the ways we try to build bridges in society, regardless of the issue, is often we try to get the other person to change their values. Like, you have to change your values to engage with me on this topic or for us to have any sort of interaction. But what he says is we actually need to explain to people why the change we want fits with your values, in the sense that you don't have to change who you are as a person to come meet me on this side of the fence, or we can meet somewhere in the middle, perhaps, because that's going to be much more difficult if you ask someone to change their identity. So he says to conservatives, you believe in personal accountability. Therefore, you should believe in the fact that polluters or people or organizations or companies that are polluting the earth with carbon emissions should be accountable for that cost, and that we can actually use that accountability to trigger this real free market innovation that can actually maybe start to help us to address climate change. And so I find that to be such a fascinating approach, to have a conservative Christian who's supposed to, according to the labels we apply as a society, be some sort of climate denier. He went from denying to believing, and I find that to be so engaging. But I'd love to talk about other qualities that they have in common if you'd like to, but I'll stop there for the moment, because I think that I'm sure you have a lot of other questions.
Okay, sure, yeah, and we can circle back to about the different qualities that you noticed after doing all of these interviews. When I saw the word polarized, what immediately came to mind in this day and age is social media. So how much of a role do you feel like social media has played in polarizing our society?
I don't think we can, I really don't think you can underestimate how much of a role it's played. And I personally feel like hundreds of years from now, historians will look back in this era, and that will be the seminal moment in which our discourse as a democracy changed. And so I have heard it said by scholars before, though, that we maybe should give ourselves a little bit of a break for the fact that we haven't yet figured out how to navigate it. Like when the printing press came on to the scene in the mid whatever was 1500s, that actually it took people a long time to adjust to the fact that all of a sudden information was being spread throughout the world. As a library, you're used to it. You've had hundreds of years to deal with the fact that books are accessible to everyone, but they weren't accessible to most people at that time. It took people a long time to adjust to that. Now, hopefully it doesn't take us decades or centuries to adjust to the effect of the internet, but I do think that the disruption has been phenomenal. And so the question is there anyone who's actually using social media to try to bring people together, and how are they doing that? That was one of the biggest challenges I had in writing this book. I was determined to find someone who was using social media to bring people together. And I have to tell you that it was the most difficult chapter I had to come up with, because I couldn't find anybody for the longest time. And I didn't want to force it. I didn't want to just Google somebody, and then just kind of write the first thing that comes up. So I spent some time kind of organically networking and trying to figure out who the right person or people or organization was. Ended up meeting this group called the Everyday Projects, and they're led by a couple journalists, practicing journalists, who have actually spent quite a lot of time doing journalism in Africa, and this is where their organization started. They were there in Ivory Coast and Ghana and other countries to report on basically the war-torn nature of those societies, or famine, or just general poverty, whatever the issue, disease, the issue may be, that a lot of us tend to stereotypically associate with African countries. And they said, yeah, our stories were important. Those were legitimate stories. They weren't saying those were illegitimate, but they became increasingly frustrated with the fact that people who read their stories are going to get this very one-track view of what life is like there, when on a daily basis, they were interacting with people who were just normal folks, who were doing normal things. Someone going up the elevator, someone getting a cup of coffee, someone fixing a car. And so they started taking pictures of it with their iPhones, like in the early smartphone era. And then they started posting them to a blog, and eventually to Instagram. And when they hit Instagram, all these everyday life photos blew up, and people across the world, in America and elsewhere, started to see that we have more in common across these international boundaries, these oceanic boundaries, than we ever realized before. Because what we see on social media, to the point of your question, is we see the highlight reel of people's lives. We see the sensational we see things that are going to make you react in some way, maybe make you outraged. And of course, then that provokes more outrage. What Everyday Projects did was said, let's focus on things that are actually not sensational. Let's focus on things that are mundane, things that actually are reflective of what real life is like, because in that we can see our common humanity. Everyone knows what it's like to go up the elevator. Let's just show someone in Ghana doing that. Oh, look, we have something small in common. What bridge builders realize is that our differences don't make us different. They actually can bring us closer together, because we oftentimes just can't see those things. And so I found that to be such an interesting, and this is an organization, by the way, that has hundreds of thousands of followers now. So this is not something that nobody's noticing. I mean, it shows people want to see these authentic stories and images of each other.
Yeah, there's kind of a humanizing quality to that too. My armchair opinion on social media is, I think what's so bad about it is that it's so much easier to say something behind a screen than it is to somebody's face and not see them as an actual person with feelings and beliefs of their own. So that's a great project that you discussed.
Yeah.
You also too talk a lot as a journalist. Something that's very important to you is the role of journalism in both the responsibility of sharing accurate news, but then also the ability of journalists to divide people. So would you discuss more with us about what you see as the role of journalists as bridge builders?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question, because it's personal to me in the sense that, I think oftentimes as journalists, we focus on everything that's wrong with the world. We do a good job of chronicling that, all very important, but we oftentimes tend to neglect to train the lens on ourselves and say, what are we doing that may be contributing to the problem? Now, I will defend all day long journalism from, false accusations of fake news or whatever accusations that we often face, unfortunately, especially in the last several years. But I don't think that it exempts us from a conversation about what can we do to actually be a little bit better, to try to start to tell those authentic stories. Because I think, unfortunately, in some cases, we as an industry have fallen prey to, to sensationalism, or maybe to make the headline just a little bit more on the edge to try to draw people in. And I think that all those 1,000 cuts tend to lead to a death, in the sense that we will start to gradually have gradually lost the trust of people who, when they see that stories are sensationalized, or when they are just sort of done for ratings or clicks for some reason or another, or just aren't told authentically, that's going to lead to deteriorating trust. And so I think, given that I believe that healthy journalistic society or healthy journalism is crucial to our democracy, then I think we can't sit by and let this go down the same road. And so I wanted to meet somebody who was trying to restore trust between the media and the public, in particular, a part of the country where trust in the media has evaporated. And so I went to Appalachia, went to West Virginia, and I met people in West Virginia who are doing grassroots, local, nonprofit journalism, not for the glory of USA Today, where I work, or the Washington Post, a few miles from my house. It's actually because they believe that by telling those authentic stories of people in their community, that then they can begin to slowly stitch back together the bonds of trust that have been disintegrated in so many cases. And it's not that they're ignoring problems, they're not ignoring challenges. They are addressing those things, and they're not ignoring conflict, because we as journalists, we have one bias, okay? It's toward conflict. Our stories, we gravitate toward that, and that's what we want to write about. Oftentimes, rightfully so, most times. But so they're not ignoring conflict, but they are trying to position their coverage of it as coverage of more solutions, and basically trying to sort of say, okay, yes, there's a conflict over whatever the issue may be. Maybe it's the largely defunct coal mining industry in Appalachia, but instead of dwelling on, as one person for the book told me, the stereotypically toothless miner who's got the Confederate flag in his truck, instead of focusing on those stereotypical images, the question is, how can we say, no, let's spin this forward. Let's talk about maybe how do we talk about getting coal miners employed, or how to, getting them retrained, getting new jobs, and finding solutions. And what you see is that, interestingly enough, at least in the readership data that I found in researching for this book, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, actually, which is owned by Gannett, which is my employer, so just full disclosure, but they actually eliminated most of their opinion content. Like, they got rid of all the hot takes and like a lot of like the columns that just make people mad. And they actually invested instead in solutions-oriented journalism, where they said, let's focus on how to fix things. And yeah, it's going to be controversial, and we might still disagree. But if we can at least say, what are the solutions, then people might see that we have actually your best interest in mind. And then we can have an honest conversation about what those solutions should be. So honestly, as a journalist, I think we have a responsibility to look at it through that lens. And I do think that in a lot of cases, nonprofit and especially local journalism is where it's best started. Because my backstory is, I'm from Michigan, like you said, grew up in Saline. At 17 years old, I was a reporter for the local newspaper, and I don't know why the editor trusted me, to go out to the Lodi Township Board of Trustees and to cover stories about like septic system zoning and the local gravel mine. Like, why are they arguing about these, these laws? Or why are they arguing about public safety funding and such? I didn't really know what I was doing at the beginning, but eventually I figured it out, and I had those trusted relationships with people in the community. I covered it for 5 years throughout the high school, and then of course in my college career, and I was there. Like, it was a local journalist, at least someone to tell the stories of what was happening in that community. And unfortunately, I went back a while ago and asked the township supervisor, who's still there, is there anyone writing about you guys anymore? And she said, no, we don't have any reporters anymore, because journalism has faced this economic crisis, and we just aren't as many of us as there used to be. And my theory, Emily, is that when you don't have those relationships in person between the journalist and the public, then that's going to lead to deteriorating trust. Because like, how can we expect the public to trust a journalist if they've never even met one? And so. Yeah. I think that relationships between people of difference are the fundamental way in which we can build bridges. And that's really what this book is all about.
Yeah. And, speaking about the Appalachia chapter, and it was Morgantown, right? Yeah. It seems like, there's some parallels between what you just talked about with the project in Africa and then Morgantown, and busting some of the stereotypes was a response to, the hurt feelings that came out. You referenced the Vanity Fair article, which definitely it was a pretty stereotyped version of Appalachia. Yeah. And then the project that was done in response to that. But yeah, it seems like a common theme of that is to really show these people as people in their everyday lives, and not the stereotypes that people may think of when they immediately think of that.
Yeah.
I also think too, talking about how they removed opinion pieces, that might help with the echo chamber that I'm sure you get, just looking at articles like that too. I was thinking, somebody who reads that article and like agrees with it is probably going to be of a certain mindset anyway. And then somebody who's not of that mindset is either going to avoid that article or get furious over it. Yeah. So yes, it definitely thinks that the focus on factual information would probably be a great step in the right direction.
Yeah, it's like the world has enough opinions already. It's like, I don't really think we need to flood the world with more opinions. And we live in this like hot take culture, and the idea that we can agree to disagree is a total anachronism. Like, we can't agree to disagree anymore. And so that's part of the problem. And here's what's interesting though. I met a group called Braver Angels, which actually tries to essentially teach Americans how to talk to each other again, which like, that's how bad things have gotten, like that we actually have a group that's trying to teach people just how to have conversations with each other. And I asked the founder, David Blankenhorn, is the goal here to get people to agree, like to have some sort of consensus, whether it's a centrist policy or something to that effect? And he said, that's actually not the goal. The goal is not to get people to agree. Like, bridge building the goal isn't necessarily to get people to agree with each other. He said the goal is to get people to reestablish this degree of social trust, where I am invested in you as a human, and I care about your story. I can see our common humanity. And if you can do that, then you can have honest conversations about the things on which you do disagree. Because like he said to me, conflict is actually critical to our democracy. Like, if the only place, he said, where you don't have conflict is just an authoritarian system, and we don't want that, of course. So conflict's going to be with us forever, and the only question is, how do we deal with it? And conflict is like friction generates fire, and the only question is, is it a refiner's fire that you can use to ultimately make something good out of it, or is it going to be a fire that burns the whole place down? And that's where we find ourselves today.
Yeah. And there is some interesting use too of marriage counseling principles too.
Yeah, that same group actually. And I thought that's kind of how I started the prologue for the book, because I thought it's like, in America, we're like one big dysfunctional family, but we're better off when we're getting along, where we're having conversations, when we are not estranged from each other. An estranged family never works, and so and ultimately it can just lead to tensions getting worse over time. And so that the marital counseling sessions that I write about in the first book, or the principles I should say, are pretty interesting, because they actually fueled this braver angel strategy of helping people to figure out how to talk to each other again. Problem is, we can't send the whole country to marital counseling sessions to talk about how to get to talk to each other, to their neighbor again. So how do we do that on a broader scale is kind of how I tried to focus the book.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the biggest issues in recent years has been race relations, and you talk about that a lot throughout the book. What do you see or what were some examples you had of bridge builders trying to bridge those gaps in communication there? Because it's obviously a hot button issue that has been pretty volatile. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, I think, the first thing that I think is really important to say is, like, as a white man, it's like, I don't have the solutions. And I think oftentimes the most important thing for me as a white person is to listen, and so unfortunately, we live in a speak first, listen second culture, but bridge builders listen first and speak second. And I found that quality was central to this organization called Coming to the Table, which I had the chance to participate in a session that they did in Indianapolis, where essentially they have groups throughout the country where they are organizing discussions on the legacy of slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow, basically the presence of racism, which is still obviously an active factor in American life. And so they are trying to engage in this topic. But you know what? What they do is they organize these circle discussions where you sit in a circle and you actually have to pass like a rock from person to person. If you don't have the rock, you can't speak. So I was in a group of like maybe a dozen people, and it was so weird to like not be able to say anything unless you had this rock. So what it did was it forced you to actively listen, to say, I have to try to invest in what the other person is talking about. And like, you may have like this like instantaneous reaction to whatever they say, but by the time it gets around to you, you've been a little more thoughtful about it, and you haven't, but the fundamental premise is that when you come shoulder to shoulder with people, basically they can help show you what life looks like from their perspective. If you and I are face to face, then you're telling me what life is like from your perspective. That doesn't work as much. This is the classic literary principle, show, don't tell. It's the same thing when it comes to building bridges on an issue like race or anything else, really, which is oftentimes, especially as white people, we have to form relationships with people of color to say, I may not understand, and maybe I won't ever be able to understand because I'm not in your position. But unless I come over to you, then I won't be able to sort of see why you are challenged in the way you are, or whatever issues you face. That's one thing that I think is important. And we can't expect Black Americans in particular to meet us halfway. That's not, given how much oppression there's been over time, we can't expect them to meet us halfway. But here's the interesting thing. I actually had a chance to meet some real life bridge builders for this book. I said, I would talk to people who actually build bridges, contractors, engineers, designers. And I talked to them, they said, you know what? Sometimes we don't build the bridge to meet halfway. sometimes we build the bridge from one side of the ravine to the other. And I find that to be so interesting and telling. And it applies in the metaphorical sense too. You just can't always wait for someone on the other side to build a bridge to you. You actually may have to build the bridge toward them. And sometimes because it's up to you to do it, and sometimes because they're never going to do it. Maybe Bob Inglis, the Republican congressman who's working on climate change, maybe those conservatives are never going to build that bridge on climate change. But if he can successfully build the bridge to them, then maybe we can start to actually tackle that issue. And so I find that metaphorical comparison with the real life bridge building to be really compelling. Another thing, sometimes you have to also have a firm foundation. You can't build the bridge without a firm foundation, and that has to be rooted in truth. We can't start the conversation unless we have some sort of semblance of agreement. That can be really difficult, and we can certainly talk about that too. But but the point is, bridges, they transform societies. They change the way we live. If you think about San Francisco, the first thing that comes to mind is the Golden Gate Bridge, because they define societies. Nobody changes the world from an island.
Yeah. So for these bridge builders too, did you notice, like in the case of Mr. Inglis, how hard was it to recruit people from his side to join in and see what he was talking about and be willing to listen?
Yeah, I think he had a tough time in the early going, but over time he's built a lot of momentum. He has more than 10,000 members, and his membership is actually exclusive to people who are acknowledged Republicans or acknowledged conservatives who are say, I want to do something about climate change. So he's not going to accept anyone who, he said, the point is not that I think that we don't want Democrats and liberals. It's not to be exclusive of them. It's that the point is, I need to actually show, again, you don't have to compromise your values. We can actually show you how this is something that fits with your values, and it's interesting because I often think that one of the most depressing thoughts that we have, and it's understandable, is that people will never change, that people are not capable of changing, whether it's on race or politics or religion or something like that. But, I met a guy named Alvin Edwards, Pastor Alvin Edwards of the Charlottesville Clergy Collective. He's the pastor of the Mount Zion African Baptist Church in Charlottesville. And he's actually formed this group to address racial reconciliation, religious reconciliation in the wake of what happened in Charlottesville in 2017. Actually, technically his group was formed before that, but they've really been supercharged since then. And, they're having tough conversations, and they're trying to actually reach people on these really difficult issues. And this is a man, African-American man who has been living with the legacy of Jim Crow, for his whole life, and, dealing with the legacy of slavery and still facing racism today. But I said to him, so how, after what happened, especially in Charlottesville, really just wrecking this community for a while, I said, how do you maintain faith that people can change? And he said, I have to believe that other people can change, because if I believe that they can't change, then that's a belief that I can't change. And he said, I can't accept that. And I found that to be so fascinating. Bridge builders, they do get discouraged. They're not always optimistic. They're realistic about the challenges they face. They are not ignorant of ignorance. They understand that these are really difficult issues, but they also believe that people are capable of change.
Yeah. So in the age of COVID, I think that's been one of the more polarizing issues we've dealt with lately.
Yeah.
Do you see any opportunities for bridge building?
Yeah,
once this is all said and done?
Oh man, that's a good question. That's really tough, and in the middle of writing this, I was actually 75% of the way done with the book when COVID really hit, and I had to kind of pivot a little bit and incorporate some of that. And one of what I wanted to do is, I said, I've got to do a chapter that sort of addresses exactly what you just asked. And I met with a couple groups that are trying to actually bridge gaps on misinformation and try to help people connect with the truth. And because, misinformation is swirling all around us. And in fact, so much misinformation on the pandemic that the World Health Organization has called it an infodemic, in the sense that we are literally immersed and misinformation. Like the internet is actually seems to be almost custom made to spread misinformation about an issue like this. And so, so we have to start with the recognition that this is an extraordinary challenge, and it's maybe one of the great challenges of our lifetime to deal with misinformation. So it's not going away. It's something we're always going to have to deal with. But in view of that, the groups I met with called MediaWise, which is part of the journalism organization Pointer, and the News Literacy Project, founded several years ago by a former LA Times reporter, are trying to help people basically figure out how to sort fact from fiction. Because although Americans are pretty divided, of course, on many different issues, one thing they're not divided on is the need to sort through misinformation. Like, people get that it's a problem and they want to figure out the truth. The group called More in Common did a study where they said that 67% of Americans are in what you would call an exhausted majority. Basically, people who just are exhausted with all the dysfunction and all the misinformation and so all these things that divide us. They're people who actually are pretty good of goodwill, and they want to figure out like what is true and what's not. And so we have to give Americans the chance to do that. But the problem is, if you think back to school, there was no class on how to sort fact from fiction. Like, we were taught the facts, but were you really taught how to validate sources and authenticate information? Now, this should speak directly to you as a librarian. People need your help to do this. They can go to the library and get those resources. But the problem is, of course, is that a lot of times people don't know how to do it on their own. And so I think, maybe I'm biased, that the basic principles of journalism are actually what people need to sort fact from fiction. Just thinking critically about the things that you're reading, being skeptical of your sources. We as journalists sometimes accused of being skeptics, don't believe the first thing you read. They always say, if your mother tells you that she loves you, go check it out. Now, if my mom is on this feed, I'm sorry, Mom, I have to double check whether he loved me or not. But the point is that, that we have to actually integrate those principles of journalism and fact checking into our coursework as in our education. And so, but of course, a lot of people aren't going back to school anytime soon. So the News Literacy Project and MediaWise have partnered with AARP, other organizations, to extend the lessons, essentially basically workshops to try to help people, just some basic principles. Here's the great news. You don't need a master's degree to be a journalist, okay? That's the good news. I hate to say it, but you could probably pretty quickly compete with me, because just who, what, where, when, why, and reading laterally, saying, okay, I can't necessarily trust the About Us page on this website. They could say anything they want. How do I go to another alternative source and triangulate information? And so I do think that although misinformation is always going to be a problem, there are ways we can help people reconnect with the truth. And given that the truth is so essential to helping build bridges, we have to do that. Bob Inglis actually said to me, he has what he calls a farmette in South Carolina, a really small farm. And he has Americana chickens there. And he said, some people see the chickens' eggs as blue, and some people see it as green. And he said, that's okay. He said, but we have to be able to agree that there's an egg, and sometimes we don't even agree that there's an egg. So in those cases, we're in a big trouble. But actually, I have to say, journalism colleague Amanda Ripley, whose book High Conflict, which was published a month or two ago as well, she actually pointed to, if you remember a few years ago, when there was this social media phenomenon called the dress. This thing went everywhere, where it's everyone was debating, what color is this dress? And some people saw it as blue and some people saw it as yellow. The second you saw a color, you could never see the other color. It was literally in your brain. Now, I don't really get into neurological issues and such in this book, but the point is that people of good faith can see things differently. But as long as we can agree there's a dress there, we can probably figure out some common ground.
That's funny. When you told the egg story, I immediately thought of the dress.
Yeah. Now,
So
what color did you see? What color did you see? So
I saw gold. I saw gold. What about you?
I saw blue. So there you go.
It's so weird. There's some of those auditory ones too, where you'll hear a completely different name. The brain works in mysterious ways.
Yes.
So what was the most surprising thing that you learned from writing this book?
Well, I think one of the most surprising things is that that people who try to build bridges between other people don't believe in embarrassing other people. And I think that maybe that sounds like it shouldn't be surprising, but given how much we seem to like embarrassing other people or humiliating other people, especially on social media and in other areas, it does seem kind of surprising. It's countercultural to say, if you disagree with somebody, let's try to engage them in a conversation productively. So I talked to Jane Kerrigan, who is the leader of the Annapolis chapter of the group Coming to the Table. And again, dealing with tough issues, legacy of slavery, all these really tough things. And I said, she's a Black woman. I said, how do you deal with it when someone says something that's hurtful or disrespectful or something that you really need to try to correct in some ways? She says, we don't call them out, we call them in. What she meant by that was, we're not going to call you out for the sake of shaming you or embarrassing you or humiliating you, because that is just going to generate a counterproductive response. Like, you're not going to engage, you're going to become more distant, and understandably so, because we as humans don't want to be humiliated. So what you do, though, is you say, I want to call you into the conversation to have the shoulder-to-shoulder relationship and to say, let me show you why what you said was hurtful to me, or let me show you why I see the world this way. And I think that is arguably the most important aspect of this, is to say, if you start by shaming somebody, that's just going to completely eliminate the possibility that you'll ever be able to connect with them. And it might feel good. Here's the interesting thing. Latasha Morrison, who formed this group called Be the Bridge, trying to build bridges between Black and white Americans within the context of Christian churches, said to me, that shame elevates me, meaning like it makes me feel good, but it's not going to help me in the end, because it's just going to lead the other person in the wrong direction. And honestly, the most compelling argument for building bridges between people who are not like each other is that it's the best way for you to achieve progress on whatever it is you want. Like, let's go back to climate change. Let's say you want to get something done on climate change. The best way is probably, because we live in a two-party system where there's not much that's going to happen unless we have some sort of agreement or some sort of ability to respect each other and work together. Then, barring some sort of political revolution, which I don't see happening, you're going to have to figure out a way to reach the other side. So if you don't try to build that bridge, then you're actually setting yourself back. And that's what's interesting, is that maybe this is the most surprising thing of what I found. There's room for being selfish in bridge building, in the sense that you have something you want, but you can't accomplish it unless you reach the other person, because our destinies are interwoven with each other. Martin Luther King said, and we're all caught up together in this inescapable web of mutuality. And Valerie Kaur, the author of a book called See No Stranger, really wonderful memoir that was published a year or two ago, said it like this. She said, you are a part of me I do not yet know. Meaning, I can't understand perhaps why our destinies are interwoven with each other, but I know that your destiny is connected to mine, in the sense that if I don't help you get ahead, then I won't get ahead. And that is a common quality of the bridge builders in that.
It's great. Here's something pretty hopeful too. I was actually on a listserv. I was reading a listserv discussion the other day for my profession, and the topic of race came up, and it was starting to get heated. There was some back and forth. Somebody actually used that phrase, I'm not going to call you out, I'm going to call you in. And it ended up, they moved it to like a round table discussion where people could, discuss it without attacking each other. Yeah. And I was really impressed by that. So I wonder too if, these methods, they're catching on. Maybe it doesn't seem like it, but they are.
Yeah, I think that's really cool to hear. And, I think part of it on race actually may start with white people like myself, kind of like getting over this being scared about discussing our own racism, in the sense that Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote the book How to Be an Anti-Racist and several other really great books, he you may not agree with everything he says, and that's okay. Again, that's sort of the point. But he actually says, listen, like, there is no such thing really as like racist or not racist, that like everyone has a degree of racism in some way or another. And so the goal is to eliminate as much as possible, and to basically to be an anti-racist, as he says. But, so I think he kind of, in a way, is trying to eliminate the stigma of saying, yeah, you know what, there are some things that whatever I grew up thinking for some reason or whatever it is, I need to be aware of those if I'm going to try to eliminate them.
Yeah. Do you think there's any, having interviewed a number of bridge builders, did you notice any personality traits between them? Because I was just thinking that it would probably involve a little bit of being able to put your ego aside too,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you want to win, it's just
Yeah,
human
exactly.
nature.
Yeah, again, I think they are really countercultural. It is not normal to try to reach people who aren't like you and to try to sort of live in an uncomfortable middle. I'm fascinated with mediators, professional mediators, who their entire job is to try to bring people who are warring together. I find that to be so interesting. And like a lot of times, if you're in the middle of the war, you get shot, so like it's not a comfortable place to be. But I find the common qualities to be pretty interesting. Number one, bridge builders acknowledge the truth. They again, like they admit that there are things that have happened in the past. They don't paper over the past. They do believe in accountability, but like I said, they do not believe in shame. And that there's a distinction there. That we're going to talk about what happened in the past. We're not going to shame you about it, but we are going to discuss it and say, yes, these things happen. Now, what can we do about them together? And then secondly, bridge builders believe in that you can't label people, that if you label them, then you're not fair to their complexity as a person. Bridge builders choose nuance over caricature. We live in a world that's filled with caricatures. The bridge builders see people of difference differently. They do not, they understand that there is more to them than what you can see on the surface. And that if you put a label on them, then you're actually going to end up just leading to misunderstanding because you can't really label anyone. So they avoid labels as much as possible. And, thirdly, bridge builders believe that you have to listen first and speak second. Like listening is so crucial. And again, now listen, we're not talking about things like, listening to hate, listening to intolerance, that sort of thing. No, we don't listen to that. That's different. We're not talking about that. But on the things on which maybe there is some room for perspective, there is the need to listen because, again, it's not that you're necessarily going to agree, but it's that if I show people that I'm invested in what they have to say, then they'll start to listen to me. And that's what I think is so interesting. Like, the goal of listening is often to be heard. Like you actually want them to engage with you, but first to do that, you actually have to invest in their story. And then lastly, bridge builders also understand that sometimes conversation, it's not enough. Like it's some people aren't going to be able to reach common ground or reach some sort of mutual understanding by just talking about it. And so there are other ways, things like art, for example, like theater or film or music or just some sort of alternative, maybe even social media, like we talked about before. There are all other ways, absent of conversation, that maybe you can actually start to open eyes and then maybe you have a conversation. But sometimes, yeah, talking about it may not be enough. And I think there's other things, but those are some of the key qualities that I saw.
So for the readers, what do you think are some practical steps that they could use to become bridge builders themselves or to join in the bridge building movement?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, listening is one of those very basic things that like you could literally do right now. I think that's number one. But I think the other one is, if I could suggest one thing, it would be get to know somebody who's not like you, because whether it's someone who prays differently, looks differently, or thinks differently, those kinds of relationships are the way in which we can actually reach other people. Now, I actually don't write in the book about like too much academic research on this. I wanted to keep it focused on the stories, but there is academic research called contact theory, which suggests that when you actually meet someone and you establish even just some basic contact with them, then you tend to come to a little bit more of an understanding of them as a person, and then you soften in your relationship with them, and they soften as well. And so there is actual like concrete academic research that suggests this is a really productive way to try to address our divides, is to say, if I can just get to know you as a person, maybe we'll start to understand each other. One of the great analogies I like, this is actually not in the book, but is, let's say you and I are sitting at a stadium or an arena, we're watching a game on the field, and the play unfolds, and I see the way the play, and to me it looks obvious what happened. But there are 70,000 people in the stands, or if it's the big house, 110,000 people in the stands who've seen the play just a little bit differently than me. 110,000 people with a slightly different perspective. People on the other side of the stadium have a completely different view on what happened on the field. Same thing happened, but we have different perspective. And so the only way often to reach some sort of understanding is to go to the other side of the stadium, to say, show me what you saw. How many times have you watched a game that on TV, you thought you saw what you saw, then you see the replay and realize, oh, I actually was wrong. So it's like, you got to have that. But if you're not shoulder to shoulder, you don't sit next to them on the bleachers on a cold November day in the big house, you're not going to understand, why Michigan can't beat Ohio State. Okay. Sorry about that.
Well, before we turn it over to ask some questions from our participants, was there anything else you wanted to leave us with?
Well, like I said earlier, the story of Pastor Alvin Edwards is always maybe the most compelling story of this book. This idea that if I don't believe that other people can change, then I can't change. That to me is one of the most compelling aspects of this. And but I would say also there's a few concrete sort of solutions, like things we can actually do to try to translate this concept of relationship building into our institutions as a society. It's like, okay, maybe you agree this is all good, but you're thinking to yourself, grassroots stuff, that's not really going to make a big difference. Now, I disagree, because I do believe that a bottom-up sort of revolution along these lines, it would ultimately influence policymakers and other people, because it doesn't seem to me that we're going to have much top-down change, in the sense that people at the top are not going to suddenly figure out how to get us to agree. That's not going to happen. So it's got to be people on the ground. But if we can start to take these principles of relationship building, integrate them into things like our schools, for example, I think that's a good place to start. We are now living in this Zoom remote era culture of school, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, of course, and I know kids are going back to school, but we now know that video learning is possible. Why can't we set up remote projects between students from different districts to say, you guys, you're living in a rural area, you're living in an urban area, you're living in a wealthy area, you're living in a poor area, whatever the difference is, let's get students together and let's have them do class projects, learn from each other. Maybe they interview each other, they learn each other's stories, they form relationships. We don't need, it's like school integration. We're not having a conversation about that as a country. I don't know if that would be something that would be worth doing or not. We actually don't have to wait for that. We can actually start to form relationships anyways. There's nothing to stop teachers from doing that. So I think things like that, things like colleges, they can start to have freshmen room together and with people who aren't like them. Like most colleges, unfortunately, allow freshmen to pick their own roommates beforehand. What happens? The Washington Post reported this. The rich kids find the rich kids, which means a lot of times the white kids find the white kids. And, your politics are probably going to be similar, and your race is probably going to be similar. And that's not going to do much for us, because then we just remain ensconced in these camps, these separate camps. And so I do think there are little things that can be done. And lastly, the thing I think is maybe the most compelling is a national public service campaign that is actually a bipartisan idea and has got bipartisan approval in Congress under President Obama to triple the number of public service positions in this country. All we're waiting for is the funding to do it. The idea being that if we can actually get people to go out and serve other people together, then they are shoulder to shoulder. Then they can form relationships between people who aren't like them, and learn from the people they're serving. That can actually be what political scientists call the moral equivalent of the foxhole in a war, where you end up with this lifelong bond between someone you're serving with in war. Well, you can actually end up with a lifelong bond between someone you're serving with in your community too.
Wonderful. Well, before we turn it over to Anna, who's going to read some of the questions we've gotten from the participants, I wanted to sincerely thank you for this conversation tonight.
Thank you so much.
It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so appreciative of it. And I know you guys did an event for my first book, Detroit Resurrected, a few years ago. And I'm just so glad I'm able to join you. And any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Nathan.
Okay. Well, thank you both. That was really fantastic and so much information and so exciting, all this work that's going on. So one question was, you talked about, I mean, a lot of this is happening with adults, but what about, and you talked about students. Is there an optimal age for this to start happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't necessarily know that we need to, I would say ideally earlier is better. It's kind of like language learning. They'd say that, kids, if they learn a foreign language when they're really young, then it's going to be more likely that it'll sink in. I think the earlier is better, but I do think it has to be a lifelong thing. We can't just say, if you meet someone who's not like you as a 5-year-old, then you're suddenly going to appreciate everyone's differences, but I do think that we can start at a young age, and we don't have to accept the sort of the structures that we've been presented with as a society. We can actually, start to counteract those. And I do think maybe this is one thing the internet can help us out with.
Mm-hmm. One of the participants asked, will you be selling branded bridge builder rock constructed out of foam?
I should. It's like, journalists are not the best at like thinking about how to actually make money off these kinds of things. Like, I wish I could do that. That would be smart.
I'll buy one.
Yes, that's my next project.
Did you want to comment on the logo on your cover?
Sure.
It's very interesting.
Oh, I love it. I think it's really cool because if you look at it carefully, you can see that it's sort of, it looks like an arc. It actually reminds me of, it looks like a bridge, of course. It reminds me of the Arlington Memorial Bridge, actually in Washington, D.C., that connects the D.C. to Arlington Cemetery, National Cemetery. A lot of times you see, this is the bridge you see on TV shows when they swoop over the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. But it also looks like people who've gathered hand to hand. And I was really cool. It was really exciting to see when my publisher came up with that, because to me, it illustrates exactly what I wanted to communicate, which is that, relationships, again, connections between people are the only way to build bridges. It's like, I never met someone in writing this book who said, yeah, and then we enacted this policy and everyone got along. That didn't happen. Maybe there's someone out there who's done it, but I didn't meet him. No, and again, not to say that policy isn't important. It really is. There are some people who believe it's policy first, relationship second. I mean, I understand that perspective. I just don't see it as having played out that way, that usually it's the opposite way. And so policy, again, may be the final goal, perhaps. Maybe it's just to form some sort of trust between you and your neighbor or something. But whatever the goal is, I do think that those relationships are important. By the way, I saw a question by an attendee who asked who I was referring to. Someone who said, who wrote her own memoir about, and she said, you are a part of me I do not yet know. That was Valerie Kaur, Kaur, and she wrote a book called See No Stranger. And I don't recall the subtitle, but it was See No Stranger. And it was a really compelling book. She's a Sikh civil rights activist. And she actually, she had a speech that went viral after the 2016 election. And she said, where, there was a lot of pain in her community. And she said, what if the darkness that we're seeing is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb, in the sense that, what if America is just now being born and it's not dying? I thought that was so interesting that, yeah, but you know what? The birth is a really difficult process, extremely painful. It may not be, very sightly, but in the end, you have beauty that comes out of it. And I thought that was such a compelling perspective.
Yeah. Okay, it looks, I think we've answered all the questions. So thank you both, Emily and Nathan, for having a conversation about this great book, Bridge Builders, Bringing People Together in a Polarized Age.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, good night.